Americans on the European Front. This is our fourth lecture regarding our study of World War I, specifically from an American perspective. So, as we said last lecture, we have declared war, and now it is just a matter of time till American soldiers show up in Europe. But we just can't drop guys over in Europe. Guys have to be trained in order to be successful in going to Europe. So we were not prepared to send any army to Europe in April of 1917 when we declared war. At that time, we only had a small army. We only had 100,000 men trained in uniform. There were 16 other nations around the world that had bigger armies than the United States. I know we look at ourselves as the most powerful nation in the world militarily, specifically militarily. At that time, that wasn't the case. And we didn't need to have a huge army. Remember, we were surrounded by an Atlantic Ocean and a Pacific Ocean. We had Canada, our friends to the north, and Mexico, our friends to the south. So there wasn't any real threat to us. We were kind of isolated. Our Marines, for the most part, were based in Pacific and in the Pacific region, the western part of the United States, and in Central America. And our National Guard wasn't ready. We were not ready for war. Now, President Wilson did give General John J. Pershing, you can see John J. Pershing right there, famous World War I general. They did send over a small force of 14,500 men just to help out while the rest of America was training. We also sent ships, we sent supplies, we sent weapons, we sent money, we sent other things. I mean, you need a lot more than just soldiers for a war. General Pershing asked for 1 million men by 1918. So Congress has to get involved here, and they passed something called selective service. Now, you guys, when you turn 18, have to register for selective service. It's essentially in case there was ever going to be a draft. This way it gives us a pool of young men and women to select from. The odds of us getting a draft again are very small, but just in case, we always have to be prepared. So this was selective service was authorizing a draft of young men for military service. You can see this was one of the posters, making sure that all men between the ages of 21 and 30 must show up at their specific location, whatever it happened to be in their town, on Tuesday, June 5th, and that was the big registration day. By November of 1918, 24 million young men had registered for selective service. Now, that didn't mean you were going anywhere. If you wanted to go and serve your country, you could certainly just volunteer to be in the U.S. Army, or in the Navy, or in the Marines, or whatever. This was a just-in-case scenario, and 3 million were drafted, chosen by a lottery system, so you didn't know if you were going to get picked or not, to serve. Our volunteers and our National Guardsmen made up the remainder of what was called the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF. That's what our group is going to be called, our Army, our military that is going to World War I. They will be called the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force. There was women who also volunteered to help out. I mean, they couldn't serve in the Army at the time, but they served as nurses, drivers, and clerks for our Army. You can see the cover of the New York Times. President calls the nation to arms. Draft bill signed. Registration June 5th. Regulars, the regular soldiers under Pershing to go to France. So those who were drafted, again, you have to be trained. You can't just throw bodies at a war situation. You have to train our men, and we set up training camps around the country. And some of the things that they had to be trained in is stuff that they probably wouldn't be good at, just in normal everyday life, like how to use a bayonet. Shooting a rifle is one thing. Shooting a rifle that has a bayonet, which is a long, like, knife or almost like a sword or a long knife attached to the front of the gun. It changes how the gun would work. How to dig a trench. And remember, that's how the trench warfare that was happening over in France. How to put on a gas mask. There was chemical warfare being used. We've talked about that. And how to throw a grenade. They also got lectured on certain strategies, and you have to practice certain things before you can go to war. Training was often cut short though, because they wanted to get you to Europe as fast as possible. So they trained you as much as they felt like they needed to, and then off to Europe. You can see our guys there practicing in a trench, with the bayonet attached to the rifle and poking at something that would represent the Germans or the Austro-Hungarians or the bad guys coming, across no man's land and into the trench or over the trench, and this was them practicing how to get them with the bayonet. And you can see our troops over in France kind of getting an idea or a feel for what it was like to be in a trench, to dig a trench. Again, practice makes perfect. And there's our guys ready to go, all clean and optimistic. You can see they all kind of look confident. So we'll see how they look after they serve over in Europe for a while. Now, one of the problems is, how do we get our guys over to Europe? Because the Germans famously were using submarines to take out, ships. As a matter of fact, the U-boats had sunk more than 400 ships by this point. So our War Department, we don't have a War Department anymore. We have a Defense Department. A War Department sounded so aggressive. After a while, we're going to change that to Defense Department, which is at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The War Department had to figure out how to transport troops safely overseas. So in May of 1917, as we're going to start moving guys over there, merchant and troop ships would travel in what was called a convoy. A convoy is a group of unarmed ships surrounded by a ring of destroyers, torpedo boats, and other armed naval vessels equipped with hydrophones. Remember, the hydrophones would tell us if there was any submarines in the water. This convoy system was exceptional. It was remarkably successful. Not one U.S. troop ship was sunk. And so you can see some of the most popular routes, whether they left from Montreal to St. Lawrence and into the Atlantic, from Halifax, which is technically Canada, and then Boston or New York. They all took generally the same path across the Atlantic, which is a difficult body of water. It's kind of a violent body of water as compared to the Pacific. And then you can see where the convoy, the big meeting area was, because that red line represents where most of the U-boats were within. So once you got to that red line, here we go. The potential of getting sunk was real. And again, we were very successful at this. None of our troop ships were sunk. And you can see, this was not just a couple ships. We had, it took a whole fleet of different ships with different technology and different tactics. You can see the destroyers kind of using a zigzag motion on the on the flanks, on the outsides, and then a destroyer leading the charge as well. And this is a picture of our convoy system working its way across the Atlantic. Doesn't look so violent there, but it's usually a very choppy body of water. So there we are, our soldiers in Europe ready to go. So General Pershing decided that our AEF, our Army, was going to kind of do their own thing. The Allies weren't thrilled about this, but they were thrilled to have us, and we were going to kind of do our own thing. He wanted to save our soldiers for offensive attacks. The Germans and the French, or the British and the French, had taken quite a beating in the trenches and kind of understood how that worked. We were going to be used to go on the attack and to try to take positions from the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. The British and the French were surprised by how strong and energetic and healthy the American soldiers were. But again, they've been fighting in the trenches for a couple of years. Anything new was going to be wonderful. Our soldiers were referred to as doughboys. Nobody really knows the story or the history behind that. It just kind of like there's a couple theories out there, but nothing firm that explains why we were called doughboys. Now, another thing you have to understand is the time frame we're talking about here. We're talking about the 19 teens, and at that time, the Jim Crow South was very real, and segregation was very real. But black soldiers were either volunteered or were drafted to participate in the war. Now, the units were segregated, so if black soldiers served, they served together. They did not serve in what would be called a mixed unit or an integrated unit. And most of them never actually got to see combat. And some of them were thrilled about not going into actual combat and for doing manual labor to help the cause. Others were upset because they wanted to get in and get their hands dirty and go to war and be heroes just like our white soldiers. You can see one of our African American units. All right, so things are going to start to change. And it starts to change because of what's going on in Russia in 1917. Now, we've talked about this a little bit. We said that there would be a revolution in Russia. And this was kind of organized by the Germans. I'm not going to get too deep into that story, but they cut a deal with a guy named Vladimir Lenin. And Vladimir Lenin was a guy who studied Karl Marx and communism. And he's going to lead a group called the Bolsheviks to overthrow the Russian government. There's Vladimir Lenin. Apparently very mesmerizing when speaking, because you can see this guy right here. Look at this guy. Very, 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 it's like he's been hypnotized. Everybody else is trying to look away, but this guy, he's glued to it. So this civil war that happens in Russia goes on for 2 years. So the Russians aren't worried about World War I anymore. And now the Germans, this worked really well for them because now they don't have to fight the war on two fronts. They don't have to fight that Eastern Front anymore. So now they could send their troops to try to finish off the British and French armies on the Western Front before the bulk of the American soldiers can get there. And at first, they were having great success. By March of 1918, they were within 50 miles of Paris. So we saw this happening, and this is where General Pershing is trying to get as many American soldiers over there as fast as possible. So he sent troops to the Western Front to turn back the German offensive. So even though he wanted to use us mostly as offense, he is going to have to try to defend Paris. And it works. We do help the French save Paris, and we took, I use the word blunted there, blunted the edge of the German advance. Basically, we cut it off. We stopped their attack and then started to turn the attack back toward them. And they weren't used to that happening. The Germans have been on the attack a lot. Well, we were getting 250,000 new American soldiers in France each month. And remember, the Germans and the British and the French, everybody, the Austro-Hungarians, they've all been in this thing for years now. In the trenches, just a horrible situation. And here come these new, clean, healthy, energetic Americans. And it wasn't exactly what they wanted to see, what the Russians wanted to see. I'm sorry, what the Germans wanted to see. The Russians were doing their own thing now with their own revolution. Now, one of the things that we had to our advantage is a new weapon called a tank. These tanks were great because they were, and we saw pictures of that during the militarism part of the earlier lectures. The Allies were able to cross the trenches, go through no man's land, and over and through everything that was in their way, and break through the German lines. Meanwhile, they're getting shot at, and little that the Germans had could stop a tank. By September of 1918, the Allies were ousting the Germans from long-held positions, cutting off their supply of lines, and forcing them into a full retreat. Things were going great for the Allies at this point. We also needed to manufacture airplanes, and we wanted to at least have the technology that the Allies had, if not better. Now, when we were up in the air, we were using airplanes to scout enemy positions, but as time went on, the enemy's got a bad guy up in their plane, and we've got our guy up in his plane, and now they start going after each other. They start firing pistols or machine guns at each other in the air, and this became well, they were known as dogfights. We would also shoot down hot air balloons that were being used because, again, the high point, the highest you can get up there, you can see enemy advancing or their positions, or where they are, how many soldiers they have, where do they seem to be moving to. We can get a lot of information from having people up in those balloons. Well, they were doing that, and they could also, from hot air balloons, fire on soldiers that are on the ground. The Germans also had something called Zeppelins. These were kind of neat. They were floating airships, kind of like a blimp today. And these Zeppelins were able to carry bombs and launched more than 100 raids on the city of London in England. These bombing raids were not very effective. As you can imagine, being up in a blimp and dropping bombs, those bombs are not going to be very accurate. They don't have like laser guided technology or the computer guided technology that we have today. So they weren't necessarily very accurate, but they did disrupt, they did frighten, and they did confuse. Well, the Allies kept pressing, and eventually the Central Powers started to collapse one by one. Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire signed peace treaties with the Allies in the fall of 1918. They saw the writing on the wall. They saw that we were a force to be reckoned with, and the Allies were winning at this point. Austria-Hungary broke up their nation as ethnic groups from within declared their independence. German commanders begged for peace without total surrender. They didn't want to give up everything that they had accomplished, but the Allies said, no, it must be a total surrender, and we're going to take all the good stuff. At this point, when the Allies refused, bands of German soldiers mutinied, meaning that they left. They saw that they were going to get slaughtered if they stayed in this war, and the German government refused or were not looking to quit at this point. The German Kaiser, the leader of Germany, fled to Holland, and civilian representatives of a new government that's taken over in Germany signed an armistice, which is a ceasefire, on November 11th, 1918. And every old school documentary on World War I would, bring in the guy with the deep voice, and they signed the armistice on November 11th, 1918, at the 11th hour, on the 11th day, on the 11th month, 1918. And they did. They signed it at 11 o'clock on November 11th, the 11th month, and made a thing out of it. Now, something that we can certainly relate to: the American troops arriving in the spring of 1918, meaning that they were showing up in Europe in 1918. They brought with them a new strain of the flu. Okay, they brought a virus with them. They got it in America, didn't know they had it, brought it with them, thought it was just normal flu, and next thing you know, from Americans, they get this crazy flu over in June of 1918. So it goes across the Western Front in that's France, and then it went away. And seemingly, this was a victory, over the virus. However, a second wave, a much deadlier wave, came in the fall of 1918, and then eventually a third in the winter. People were wearing masks, and a lot of the things that we're doing in terms of quarantining and masks and hygiene and all, washing your hands and all that. Well, they were doing that same thing then too. It struck people of all ages and could kill within a few days. It spread very easily in crowded, unsanitary conditions, like military bases and cities at the time. In little under a year, more American soldiers actually died from the flu than they did in battle in World War I. Over 500,000 Americans are going to die with this influenza, and 30 million people across the world died because of this influenza that we dropped over in Europe. The results of the war, well, as you can imagine, anybody who's had family members serve our country, especially in the more recent times, PTSD is a real thing. The physical scars are easy to see. It's the mental scars that are hard to see, and they both ran deep. 50,000 Americans died in battle, and many more died of disease. which was very small as compared to the Europeans, but still a crazy number. The total death toll of 8 million soldiers and sailors died in World War One. And you can see some of the images of our guys on stretchers there. This picture, pretty gruesome, where you see just like bodies and body parts just laying there. The sick and wounded certainly outnumbered the dead. And you can see these guys here in the hospital beds. These guys have this look in their eyes, right? This look in their eyes. That's in wartime they call this the 1,000-yard stare. It's just these guys have seen things and experienced things that, man, it's just awful. And they look older than they are, and they just kind of stare off almost like through you. This guy is having what is old school plastic surgery. You can see like what are like plastic masks on the back. This guy is going to eventually put his face on, like almost like it's glasses, because his face is so severely damaged from the war that he would put on this like plastic thing. Looks like his face. But it's a covering on the front of his face. Millions of civilians died during and immediately after the fighting from starvation, from disease, or from war-related injuries.